In the last video, we talked about mechanisms of microevolution, which again is the change in allele frequencies over from one generation to the next. We discussed mutation, migration, and genetic drift in the last two videos. Remember that natural selection and sexual selection are also mechanisms of evolution, but we're going to talk about those in the third topic of this module. So for this video, we're going to talk about the evidence for macroevolution. And macroevolution, remember, is evolution on a larger scale. So it's still using the same mechanisms of evolution that we talked about, but now we're talking about the rising of new species from old species that look very different, and that this type of speciation has been occurring over millions and millions and millions of years. So there's lots of different lines of evidence for macroevolution. We're going to be talking about 5 of them: fossils, homologous structures, vestigial structures, embryology, and molecular biology. We'll define each one and give some examples. This image down here is showing different species of Galapagos finches that all currently exist today. You can see that there's a lot of similarities, but also differences between them. We also see here, this is a line of evidence looking at using fossils and looking at the ancestors of horses. So these are early ancestors of horses. You can see these are some fossil skulls and legs. And this is the current existing genus of horses, Equus. And these are some species of ancestors that no longer exist that we think are in the line of ancestors for horses. So the first thing we're going to look at is fossils. This demonstrates the fossil record of whale evolution. And what fossils are they're basically leftover clues, usually but not always bones, from species that existed in the past. So a fossil, if you find a bone of a recently deceased deer, that doesn't count as a fossil because it's not embedded in rock. So typically we look for fossils that are embedded in rock of different ages. We can age the rock, and from that we can tell how long ago that organism lived. Typically, the older fossils, or the fossils from animals that lived or organisms that lived a really long time ago, would be found in the deepest layers of rocks, and species that that existed more recently would be found in layers of rocks that are closer to the surface. So the deeper rocks have the oldest organisms, and as you move to the surface, you're finding more and more recent species. So fossil record is used a lot in putting together what we think is the evolutionary history of different species. So when we look at the current day humpback whale, we have used fossil records to link the humpback whale to an ancestor that is terrestrial. Okay, at least this is our best guess using the fossil record. So this only represents a few different species that we have found fossils of, and there's a lot more to sort of fill in the gaps here. But if you look at this skeleton of a whale, you can see a lot of similarities in this fossil and the whale. The head shape is a little bit different, but you can see there's very similar structures. The skeleton is very different. There is a small pelvis and hind limb here, but you also can see there's a small pelvis and hind limb in the humpback whale as well. The front limb is slightly different, where the finger bones are extended in the whale and less so in its recent whale ancestor. If we go back, find older fossils, we can find other organisms that have, again, some similarities, but the skull is very different here. And again, going further and further back, we find that Pakicetus is the likely terrestrial ancestor of not only whales, but all aquatic mammals in that group called cetaceans. Here we also see the evolution of the skulls of ancestors of cetaceans. Our best guess is that this species right here is one of the early ancestors of cetaceans. You can see what we're really looking at is where the nostril is. So the nostril was faced towards the front, as in most terrestrial organisms. And over evolutionary time, different species in the fossil record show that the nostrils are sort of migrating back in the different species. And so here's where the nostrils are located in the Amazonian dolphin, which again is closely related to other dolphins and whales. So the fossil record allows us to create a likely story of ancestors based on the similarities in skeletons. Homologous structures are a really compelling line of evidence for evolution. Homologous structures are body parts of species that have similar features, and those similar features indicate that there was a common ancestor that had those features, and that common ancestor then diverged into different groups. So if we look at the forelimbs of several species of vertebrates, here we have a human arm, here we have a cat arm, this is a bird wing, and this is the front flipper of, I think it's a sea lion. So all of these are vertebrates, and they all have different functions. This one flies, this one walks on this front forelimb, this one swims, and we don't use our forelimbs to move around, but we use our forelimbs for totally different things like grasping and all of that. Anyways, but you can see that all of these structures have a humerus bone. They have the radius and the ulna, and then the same wrist bones and finger bones are present in every one of these different species. In some cases, they're elongated, maybe angling a different way. Sometimes they're shortened in some cases, but the bones are there in every one of these forelimbs. That implies that we have a common ancestor that had these bones, and then those bones were modified in all the different lines that split off from that common ancestor. So that's how homologous structures support the theory of evolution. Another important line of evidence for macroevolution is vestigial structures. And vestigial structures are anatomical features that don't seem to have any sort of current purpose or relevance, but likely had significance for our ancestors. So we all have an appendix. A lot of times appendices cause us problems. We have to have them removed, and you can live without them. They don't really do anything for us. They are a vestigial structure that our non-human and other vertebrate ancestors needed, because they would house, they were actually larger. They would house bacteria that would help organisms break down cellulose. We don't actually need our appendix anymore, so this is a vestigial structure. Goosebumps are another vestigial, I don't know if it's a structure, but it's a behavior or some feature that we have. Our other mammal relatives still use this this behavior of raising hair on your body. They use it for creating a layer of air that helps insulate. So when you get cold, you get goosebumps. When an animal gets cold and it gets goosebumps, it actually provides additional insulation. Wisdom teeth, another great example of something we don't need anymore, but our ancestors used to use these teeth to grind a lot of plant material. We don't need those wisdom teeth anymore. We don't eat as much plant material, and now wisdom teeth actually causes problems, and so we usually have to get them removed. But that is another vestigial structure. Another really cool one is the nictitating membrane that a lot of vertebrates have. Owls and horses have these nictitating membranes that protect their eyes. So when they close their eyes, these membranes actually, and cats have them too, actually cover their eyes and protect them. And when they open their eyes, the nictitating membrane stays there for a second before it sort of peels away. We do not have a nictitating membrane that goes over our eye, but we have the remnants of it because our ancestors had it. That semilunar fold just in the corner of your eye is what we have left of the nictitating membrane. And other species besides humans also have vestigial structures. We actually just talked about the whale having a femur and a pelvis that's sort of left over from its terrestrial ancestor. They don't use it anymore for anything, but there it is. Those bones are still there. Snakes also, some snakes also have vestigial leg bones that they don't use anymore, but snakes also have ancestors that had 4 limbs, and so these vestigial structures are what's left over. So they're hints into our past, our evolutionary past, vestigial structures. One really cool line of evidence for macroevolution is embryology. So what I'm showing you here is the embryos at different stages for several different vertebrates. So they look pretty similar to one another, and during development, all vertebrates have some very, very similar structures. The only real way to explain that is that at some point we shared a common ancestor that had these structures during development. So, for example, gill slits. These are going to develop into gills for fish. Fish are the earliest vertebrate ancestors that we have. They're the most primitive. The first vertebrates that ever existed were fish. So the embryos of fish have gills, gill slits. Well, if you look at all these other vertebrates at certain points in their embryonic development, we all have these gill slits in the same location, but they develop into different things now for us, not gills. Another really easy one to see is that we all, as embryos, have tails. And in some cases, those individuals will keep their tails, like for fish or for reptiles, and even for birds and many mammals. But humans, although we have a tail during our embryonic development, that tail basically gets reabsorbed. So again, the fact that we all share such similar morphology as embryos suggests that we have common ancestor. And probably the most compelling line of evidence for macroevolution is if we look at DNA and proteins. I mentioned before that DNA basically codes for proteins, and that's its job. I'm sure you know this, but all living things on Earth all use DNA, all use the same nucleotides to make up DNA. Those nucleotides, whatever order they're in, they all create amino acids, which make up proteins, and every living thing uses the exact same common genetic code of DNA. So this is a great example of how it would be difficult to envision how we are not related to all other species since we all use the same genetic code. And if you look, we actually use a lot of molecular biology to see how related we are to different species. And these, looking at these molecular biology similarities usually correspond very well with the other lines of evidence, like, for example, homologous structures. We have a lot more homologous structures in common with a rhesus monkey than we do with a mouse or a chicken. And if you look at the number of amino acids that are dissimilar between humans and these different species in the hemoglobin protein, you can see that our hemoglobin protein is more similar to rhesus monkeys than it is to mice, and our hemoglobin protein is more similar to mice than it is to chickens. So the fact that all of these lines of evidence usually corroborate one another, put all together, it's hard to deny the evidence for macroevolution.